The establishment had dismissed Zoran Mamdani as just another radical voice, until he stood face-to-face with JD Vance. Mamdani came to debate policy, but what he revealed instead was something deeper: conviction rooted in lived pain. JD Vance didn't meet Mamdani's passion with empathy. He tried to counter it with politics. But when Zoran pulled out a worn photograph and spoke a single name, the entire room changed. Vance was speechless. One man spoke from experience. The other clung to rehearsed lines. And by the end of the night, it wasn't headlines that crowned the victor. It was hearts. Let us know where you're watching from, and hit subscribe so you don't miss the moment the truth shattered the expected narrative. What happened that night between Zoran Mamdani and JD Vance wasn't just unexpected, it was transformative. Even Vance's most ardent supporters fell quiet. It began under the bright lights of Manhattan's Civic Forum, a neutral venue chosen for the first nationally televised debate since Mamdani's stunning primary victory. The room buzzed with anticipation, not because of what Vance might say, but because no one knew how he'd handle Mamdani. Vance wasn't just there as vice president. He came as a defender of a system many believed was cracking. But Mamdani, sharp, calm, and unflinching, didn't waste a moment. "Let's not pretend JD Vance represents the people," Mamdani said firmly. "He represents the America of fear, of division, of silence dressed as order." The crowd erupted, some in applause, others too stunned to react. Vance didn't flinch. He kept his tone cool and careful. "I'm not here to shout," he replied. "I'm here to defend a vision of America where stability matters. Because your vision, frankly, frightens people." His words were calm, but Mamdani's truth hit harder. This wasn't just a debate of left and right. It was about what the country could be. Mamdani had mobilized a new wave of voters with proposals like dismantling the NYPD, ending carceral punishment for systemic poverty, and nationalizing key industries. Many laughed at his platform, until he won. Now, in front of millions, he stood not as an activist, but as a leader. And Vance, clinging to the rules of old Washington, seemed increasingly unsure of his footing. Vance waited, letting Mamdani speak, hoping he would trip on his own ideas. But as Mamdani built his case, with stories, with data, with fire, Vance stood still. You could feel it. The moment was building, but it hadn't landed, not yet. Stay with us. The second segment began. Mamdani leaned forward, this time even more precise. "You know what JD Vance defends?" he said, eyes locked on the moderators. "Militarized policing, mass incarceration. He calls my plan radical, but what's truly radical is pretending this broken system still works." Applause broke out behind him, not just from supporters, but from people who had once doubted. Zoran Mamdani had stepped onto the stage as a challenger. Now he was something more. Zoran Mamdani didn't flinch. Calmly, he reached for the stack of papers on the lectern in front of him. Steady, deliberate. "I've read your record, JD," Mamdani said, lifting one page into view. "And I brought it with me because I wasn't sure you'd admit what's in it." Vance narrowed his eyes as Mamdani held the page up. "Page 12, Mamdani continued. "You call for expanding qualified immunity and increasing law enforcement budgets across the board. Not reform, expansion." A wave of murmurs spread through the auditorium. "You call that safety?" Mamdani asked. "Because to millions of working-class families in Queens, the Bronx, Harlem, that's not protection. That's pressure. That's telling a mother raising 2 kids in a neglected neighborhood that she should be grateful for a patrol car instead of a grocery store." JD Vance stepped forward, trying to seize control. "What you call pressure, I call order," he snapped. "Communities need discipline. They need deterrence. The NYPD keeps people alive." There was force in his voice, but Mamdani didn't meet it with volume. He met it with silence, a silence long enough to make the room shift. "When I was 17, Mamdani said, voice even, my neighbor, a boy no older than me, was choked during a stop and frisk. He never came back home. His crime? Walking while black. You know who investigated it? No one. Because the badge shielded the truth." He let that hang. "I believe in accountability, but I also believe in dignity. You can't give people safety by humiliating them first. That struck something. The audience didn't cheer, but they listened. The energy changed. Vance tried to counter. "So your answer is less policing?" he asked, trying to regain momentum. "You want to dismantle the very thing is standing between us and total disorder?" Mamdani didn't blink. "No," he said. "My answer is protection that serves, not controls. You keep promising order while people are begging for freedom from fear." He leaned slightly forward. "And while you call me a radical, let's talk about your advisors, one of whom defended mass surveillance as a necessary tool. You speak of moderation, JD, but you wear extremism in a suit." Gasps rippled through the room. For a moment, Vance had no answer. He wasn't used to being challenged, not with truth, not with poise. This debate wasn't about who could land the best punchline. It was about who could hold their ground when tested. And Zoran Mamdani was passing that test. The moderators tried to steer the debate toward housing policy, but neither man was ready to let go of the moment. Mamdani picked up the thread again. "Our city is bleeding from the inside," he said. "The rent crisis, the evictions, the hollowed-out schools. They're all symptoms of the same disease, systemic neglect, and we won't solve it with the same tools that broke it." Vance looked at him and fired back. "You want to burn the tools?" he said. "I want to rebuild the house." The crowd leaned forward. Mamdani smirked. "Rebuild it for who, JD? The banks? The landlords? The developers?" He paused. "Let's not pretend you care about people you've never lived among." Vance didn't laugh. He didn't even respond with emotion. Instead, he opened another folder and lifted a printed quote. "This is from your economic advisor," he said. "She's on record saying rent should be abolished and housing should be distributed by local councils. Is that your plan?" Mamdani shrugged, unapologetic. "I believe housing is a human right, and if that makes some people uncomfortable, good. Comfort has never built justice." He paused. "You're not defending safety, JD. You're defending control dressed as order, and people are starting to see the difference." "You're not making people safe," Mamdani said quietly. "You're making them afraid." He let the silence sit before continuing. "You're promising stability without repair, a system with no exit ramp, no mercy. And when it fails, because it does fail, the same people you claim to protect will suffer the most." Now the crowd fell completely silent. This wasn't cable news. This was a man standing in front of America not to win, but to reveal. And it was working. "You talk about housing," Mamdani went on, turning to Vance, "but what you ignore is that your plan props up the very system that made housing unaffordable. If there's no regulation, there's no fairness. If there's no fairness, there's no access. And if there's no access, guess what? Prices don't go down. They go through the roof." Vance tried to cut in, but Mamdani didn't let up. "You talk about dignity," he said. "Let me show you what dignity really looks like. It's a mother who works 2 jobs and still gets evicted. It's a family forced to choose between medicine and rent. And it's the shame they carry while your policies tell them to work harder." The silence deepened. "This isn't about left versus right," Mamdani said. "It's about fantasy versus empathy. And your fantasy is built on the idea that power is earned, when for millions, it was never even offered." He stepped away from the lectern and walked slowly to the center of the stage. "And here's what you won't admit. Your system doesn't lift people up. It holds them down, makes them beg for permission just to survive. That's not opportunity. That's quiet oppression." JD Vance's jaw clenched. He'd faced critics before. He'd been the firebrand in previous debates. But tonight he wasn't the one setting the pace. He wasn't unmasking anything. He was being unmasked, and the audience could feel it. Vance's lines were still sharp, still rehearsed, but the atmosphere was shifting, and it wasn't in his favor. "I'm not afraid to tear things down," Mamdani said plainly, addressing the elephant in the room. "The system doesn't work. Ask anyone in this city. They'll tell you we're tired of watching our lives shrink while the powerful talk about patience," he pointed to Vance. "You defend the system because it worked for you." Vance shook his head slowly. "No, it didn't." A pause. "I was raised by a single mother," he said. "She struggled with addiction. There were nights we didn't eat. The system didn't work for us either, but we didn't burn it down. We found help inside it. The room held still. You talk about lived experience, Zoran, Vance added. Well, I have lived it too. I've been at the bottom. I know what it feels like. And I know chaos doesn't free people. It traps them. There was no applause, not yet, just tension and truth. Mamdani looked at him, steady. You're using your past to justify paralysis. No, Vance replied. I'm using it to warn people like you. People who think pain makes them prophets, but have never had to survive it. That line hit hard. Mamdani opened his mouth, then stopped. Because it wasn't just what Vance had said, it was how he said it. Calm, restrained, rehearsed, but detached. Zoran Mamdani stepped closer to the lectern again. You've got slogans, he said. I've got scars. And people are tired of being treated like test subjects in someone else's theory. That line landed hard. It drew the first genuine, spontaneous applause from the center of the room. Vance turned to the moderator, searching for the next question. But none came, because the momentum had shifted. Mamdani kept going. I'm not against order, he said. I'm against blind loyalty to a system that punishes the poor for being poor. There's a difference, and if you can't see it, you have no business leading this city. Now the applause grew, slow, steady, and spreading. Vance tried to push back, searching for ground to stand on. You keep calling me reckless, Mamdani said. But what's more reckless? Challenging broken power or defending the same failed policies that created this mess? Vance stepped forward again, voice calm but thin. What's reckless, he said, is tearing down the foundation without having a blueprint to rebuild it. But something had shifted. The audience wasn't just listening to Mamdani, they were leaning toward him. And JD Vance, once the unshakable face of old authority, was beginning to look like a man standing on a stage he could no longer control. And the true turning point, it hadn't even happened yet, because Zoran Mamdani still had one card to play. He took a breath, not dramatic but steady. Then he spoke. There's something I've never shared in a debate before, he said. Not in interviews, not in campaign speeches. But I think it matters now. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a small, folded photograph, its corners worn from age and time. This is Kareem, Mamdani said, lifting it gently. He was my friend. He was 22 when he was killed, shot during a police raid just 2 blocks from his apartment. He paused. He had just started working. He was getting clean. He was turning a corner. And then someone decided he looked suspicious. The room went still. Even Vance didn't speak. Mamdani's voice dropped, but didn't waver. They never found the officer. There was no body cam, no charges, because the system said it wasn't worth pursuing. The weight of the moment settled in. You talk about protecting people, Mamdani continued, but Kareem didn't get protection. He got profiled, cornered, erased. Now the audience wasn't just quiet, they were feeling it, mourning with him. I'm not telling you this for sympathy, Mamdani said. I'm telling you because this is what happens when fear becomes policy, when ideology replaces humanity. The moderators glanced at their notes, unsure whether to move forward. But Mamdani wasn't done. You've called for more prisons, longer sentences, harsher laws. You've said no mercy keeps us safe. But let me ask you, what about Kareem's mercy? What about his right to live, to grow, to walk down his own block without dying on the pavement? Now Vance looked away. This wasn't politics anymore. This was personal. This isn't about left or right, Mamdani said. It's about whether we're brave enough to imagine a city where justice means healing, not punishment, safety, not surveillance. He stepped back to the lectern and let the silence breathe. 10 seconds passed, and when the moderator finally spoke again, the energy in the room had completely changed. JD Vance wasn't leading anymore. He was reacting. And Mamdani, once dismissed as a dreamer, was now commanding the room. The moderator's voice finally broke the stillness. Congressman Mamdani, he asked, how would your policies address the root causes of crime and inequality without relying on heavy policing? Mamdani simply nodded, as if he'd been waiting for that exact question. Mamdani nodded slowly, welcoming the question. I believe in second chances, he said, but second chances don't come after punishment. They come after understanding. And without that, nothing changes. He let the silence linger. You fix root causes by investing in schools, in healthcare, in families, in mental health, but none of that matters if people don't feel safe enough to hope. That's where it begins. Not with fear, but with trust. Then he turned to JD Vance. You treat safety and justice like opposites, Mamdani said. But they're not. They rise and fall together. Without one, the other can't breathe. The moderator turned to Vance. Would you like to respond? He stepped forward too quickly, his voice tight, as if trying to regain lost ground. Let's be honest, Vance said. This is idealism dressed up as reform. Zoran isn't offering a future, he's offering slogans. Abolish rent, end policing. That's not leadership, it's chaos in a new uniform. Scattered claps from his base, but they were thin now, hollow. Mamdani didn't react, but then Vance pressed on. You know what's interesting, he said, voice tightening. You call me the fearmonger, but you're the one telling people their teachers are capitalists, their landlords are oppressors, their cops are monsters. He paused. That's not hope, Zoran. That's paranoia. This time the audience didn't lean in. They shifted, uncomfortable. Mamdani stayed silent. Vance continued, sensing resistance but charging ahead anyway. I've walked through neighborhoods that voted for you, Kareem, he said. I've heard their worries. They want children, they want protection, they want their kids to stay out of gangs. He turned to the audience. And I told them help is coming, but not the kind that breaks everything, the kind that restores order without putting others at risk. Some applause followed, mostly from the outer edges. Mamdani's expression didn't change, but the room was no longer with Vance. You keep painting me as the villain because I want something different, Mamdani said, finally breaking his silence. But if challenging the system makes me dangerous, then maybe the system is the real threat. Vance shook his head. You're not the villain, Zoran, he said. You're just wrong. He turned back to the crowd, and deep down, I think most of you know that. But this time, no one responded, because something had changed, the energy, the belief. The crowd wasn't leaning into fear anymore. They were leaning into vision. And Zoran Mamdani wasn't trying to win points. He was speaking truth. That's what they were listening for. Still, the night held one final moment. The moderator inhaled, his voice tense. Final question for both candidates, he said. What does justice look like to you? And how do you know your version is the right one? No policy, no bullet points, just raw vision. Vance answered first. Justice starts, he said, when a mother doesn't have to check the time before letting her son walk to the corner store. He paused, scanning the crowd. When a kid sleeps through the night without sirens outside. When a man serves his time and can go back to work. That's justice. He tried to land the line, but it didn't quite take. Then came Mamdani's turn. He stepped forward, no notes, no script, just clarity. Justice, he said softly, means no child grows up thinking dignity is a luxury. It means rewriting, not just the rules, but the assumptions behind them. He looked into the camera. If you're comfortable right now, you probably won't like my answer, because justice means shifting power, and real power never shifts quietly. Then he looked at the audience. But if you're tired of surviving, if you're ready to live, then I'm not here to scare you. I'm here to stand with you. This time the applause didn't start all at once, but when it came, it built. Because Zoran Mamdani had answered not just with words, but with direction, with truth, with something that had been missing from politics for far too long. Belief that change doesn't have to be loud to be lasting. Silence. It starts, Mamdani said softly, when a child can fall asleep without the sound of sirens, when an addict can walk into a clinic without shame, when a worker doesn't feel like the system is designed to break him before he even begins. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. It was calm, grounded, certain. Justice isn't just fairness, he continued. It's safety, it's dignity, it's order. And without those things, we don't have a liberation. We have survival. And people are tired of surviving. They want to live. He didn't say it for applause. He wasn't performing. I don't think I'm right because I have the power, he said. I think I'm right because I've been wrong. I've failed. I've fallen apart. And I've seen what happens when leaders make promises they can't keep. He glanced toward Vance, who now stood silent. You say you fight for the poor, Mamdani said. But when the smoke clears, it's always the poor who are left behind. That's not justice. That's betrayal, dressed up like leadership. Gasps. Heads turned. But Mamdani didn't look at the crowd. He kept speaking like he was in a room of one. I don't want applause, he said again. I want a city where someone like Kareem doesn't die at 22. Gunned down, forgotten. That name, Kareem, and suddenly the entire room changed. I want a justice that remembers victims, that values peace more than punishment, that speaks truth even when it hurts. He stepped back. No mic drop, no slogan, just stillness. Even the moderator hesitated, as if unsure how to follow that moment. Because the arguments, the fire, the stats, all of it had faded. What lingered now wasn't anger. It was clarity. And Zoran Mamdani had delivered it without shouting once. JD Vance looked down, hands clasped. No rebuttal. What could you say to that? The question had been asked. Mamdani had answered it with nothing but truth. But one final beat remained. The debate had technically ended, but no one moved. The moderator thanked both candidates. The cameras pulled back. Applause trickled in, polite, restrained, almost hesitant. Vance stepped down from the stage, not out of defeat, but out of distance, because something had changed and he could feel it. Mamdani lingered at the podium, nodding slowly, not as a gesture of victory, but of recognition, of what had just passed. Commentators scrambled, networks cut to commercial, but the audience didn't move, because somewhere in the silence something had become clear. This wasn't about who won the debate. This was about who drew the line, and Mamdani had drawn it. Outside the Civic Forum, crowds stood behind barricades, supporters from both sides. But even the usual noise, chants, slogans, cheering, had dulled. Protesters who were shouting an hour earlier had fallen quiet. Reporters rushed for reactions. I came here to cheer Vance, one voter said, shaking her head. But Mamdani, he didn't dodge. He didn't pretend. That matters. Another was more direct. This wasn't about left or right. This was about real life. I don't care who's more mainstream. I care who's more real. Online, the clips were already exploding. Mamdani holding up Kareem's photo. Mamdani saying, Zoran, I don't want applause. And the line that hit like lightning, people are tired of surviving. They want to live. Podcasters quoted it, critics retweeted it, designers turned it into graphics. Even skeptics couldn't deny something powerful had happened. Even critics had to admit it. Zoran Mamdani's performance wasn't just powerful. It was devastatingly effective. Meanwhile, JD Vance's campaign scrambled to recover its footing. They rushed to share clips of his most assertive moments, his defense of law and order, his claims about personal responsibility, his warning that idealism leads to chaos. But the reaction wasn't what they expected. Many of Vance's loyal supporters went silent. Others began asking questions they hadn't dared ask before. Why didn't he answer about Kareem? Why didn't he challenge the housing crisis directly? Why did he dodge the photo? Because in the end, it wasn't about fire anymore. It was about substance, and Vance, for all his composure, hadn't matched it. Meanwhile, Mamdani didn't celebrate. There was no victory tour, no press push, no campaign rally. He returned quietly to his team. One aide whispered, "You won the room." Mamdani looked out the window. "I didn't go there to win," he replied. "Then why did you go?" the aide asked. He paused, to remind them what leadership sounds like. Back at the Civic Forum, the auditorium finally began to empty, but something lingered. Not applause, not tension, just a quiet reckoning. This hadn't been a typical debate. No one would remember it as one. Because when the shouting stopped and the slogans faded, only one voice had truly landed, and JD Vance knew it. By sunrise, the headlines were everywhere. Zoran Mamdani silences the room in debate stunner. A single name, a quiet voice, a nation listens. Mamdani didn't raise his voice, he raised the bar. Cable news played the clips on repeat, not the arguments, not the zingers, but the moments of stillness, the lines that didn't ask for attention, but took it anyway, and the one that kept playing over and over again. People are tired of surviving, they want to live. It hit across party lines. Even voices within Vance's own circle began to acknowledge. The night hadn't gone as planned. One campaign strategist, off the record, said what others only whispered. Vance came ready to control the room. Mamdani came ready to speak like a president. Conservative leaders tried to rally. They issued statements praising Vance's stoicism, his discipline. But online, the base was fracturing. Some defended him, but others quietly shifted away. Because the viral clips told a different story. Within 18 hours, Mamdani's performance had over 12 million views across platforms. The name Kareem was trending, not just as a victim, but as a symbol. And people had begun talking differently. About justice, about safety, about leadership. Mamdani didn't issue a statement. He didn't have to. His words had already settled in the places no campaign ever quite reaches. Living rooms, schools, barbershops, city halls. The polls began to shift. A swing state survey taken 2 days later showed a 7-point jump in Mamdani's favorability, particularly among voters in cities that had never seen him as a voice for their concerns. Not until now, commentators began asking, was this a turning point in the national conversation? One host on a conservative network shook his head and said, whether you agree with him or not, Mamdani did something rare. He told the truth, and he didn't flinch. Meanwhile, Vance's campaign entered full damage control. They canceled 2 scheduled appearances. A spokesperson claimed logistical issues, but everyone knew the truth. They needed to regroup. Inside the campaign, things got tense. One aide said flatly, we didn't just lose a debate, we lost the message. Vance reportedly responded with a single sentence. He used pain like a weapon. That's not fair. But not everyone agreed, because in politics, fairness doesn't matter as much as clarity. And Zoran Mamdani had been crystal clear. Not everyone agreed with his policies, but almost everyone agreed on this. He showed up, he listened, he answered, and he didn't hide behind ideology. And now he wasn't just the underdog challenger anymore. He had become something far more powerful and far more dangerous to his opponents. He was trusted, and trust, once earned on a stage like that, doesn't fade easily. Still, one question remained, not for Mamdani, but for JD Vance. Could he recover? Or was this the moment that exposed the limits of his movement? The headlines faded, the hashtags slowed, but something deeper had taken root. A shift, not loud, not dramatic, but unmistakable. In Ohio and beyond, Vance's campaign faltered. They released a flashy new ad, bold colors, dramatic music, quick cuts. But the comments told another story. I used to like him, but he didn't answer the real questions. Mamdani made me feel something. Vance talked a lot, didn't say much. Donations dipped, volunteers stopped showing up. Even local party leaders began to back away, quietly, carefully. One city councilwoman put it bluntly in a private memo. We underestimated how tired people are of slogans. They want someone who speaks human. And through it all, Zoran Mamdani remained silent. No gloating, no victory lap. But his approval ratings climbed, his calendar filled, invitations poured in from cities that had once ignored him. And behind closed doors, a quiet conversation began. He might be the one, not just a voice, not just the new face of the movement, the one who could lead past the noise, the one who speaks in full sentences when others rely on hashtags, the one who could reach people no one thought he could. But the moment that truly sealed it didn't happen on stage. It happened 2 weeks later, in a church basement in Brooklyn. Mamdani arrived unannounced. No cameras, no aides, just 20 residents in folding chairs. He listened more than he spoke. At one point, an older nurse stood up. I don't agree with you on everything, she said, but when you talked about Kareem, I knew you weren't pretending. That matters now. Mamdani didn't respond with a speech. He just nodded and said, thank you. That was it. That was the win. Not in the polls, not on the news, but in the trust earned when no one was watching. As for JD Vance, he finished the race, but the momentum never came back. The crowds thinned, the applause died out. The spark that once made him seem inevitable was now just a flicker. He never brought up that debate again, never mentioned Kareem, never explained the silence. Because in politics, there are moments you survive and moments that define you. This had been the latter. Zoran Mamdani didn't defeat JD Vance with anger. He didn't outmaneuver him with policy. He didn't win by being louder. He won by being real. And long after the lights dimmed and the spin faded, people remembered the night one man didn't try to win points. He tried to speak truth, and it worked. Because when chaos gets loud, calm becomes power. And when trust gets rare, clarity becomes strength. That's what they remembered. That's why they leaned in. And that's why, long after the applause faded, Zoran Mamdani still stood tall. While the movement that tried to silence him stood stunned, unsure how they lost a battle they thought they had already won.